All financial support for this podcast comes from my patrons on patreon.com. If you'd like to join in with the patrons, please check out patreon.com/DarwinGrosse. That's DarwinGrosse. Now enjoy the podcast. Okay, today we are starting with part 2 of our discussion with Ned Lagin. In the first half, we talked a lot about the people that make up Ned's history, as well as his interface with technology. But what we didn't talk very much about was sort of like the influence of music and how he became a composer, and what that composition process looked like. So we're going to start there. Ned, why don't we have you kick off by talking a little bit about your interface with music and what it is about music that kind of inspires you and kind of like turned you on to being a creative musician, because you've been involved in so many things. Why music, and what about music drew you in?
That's both a simple and a difficult question to answer, so I'll try the simple answer first.
Okay, all right.
Simple answer is that I was given piano lessons and playing piano and listening to music with my parents when I was really very young. Right. So before I ever thought about being a musician, I became a musician by absorption and by education. When I started taking academics more seriously, and of course when I went to college, it was in the sciences. As a backup to that, I was studying music at college and at the Berklee School of Music, MIT and Berklee School of Music. But my plans were not to be a composer or a musician primarily. And those things changed because of the cultural changes that were occurring at the time, the Vietnam War and various other things. And I'll come back to that in a little while to talk a little bit about Renaissance music and how it relates to what we're talking about today. But one of the things that I like to say now in retrospect is that music is technology and chemistry, and the chemistry is biochemistry. So there are two overlapping sides to my music, and I think to everybody's music making and music listening. I wrote a note to myself a few years ago, again in retrospect, about photography and visual arts, which I do primarily now, but also about music. And I said, art is spirit animating form. It's a way of being present. And those are the things that have guided me compositionally for the last 50 years. I guess I hate to admit my age, but 50 years. And if you think about it, music is a way of being present in the world. And it's not only a way of being present in the world as a performer, as a composer, but also as a listener. And there are various aspects of music, and we could talk at some point about maybe a little bit about the theories of musical evolution. But one of the things that's very interesting about music is the concept of entrainment. And predominantly, we understand entrainment as rhythmic entrainment. You hear it with birds and crickets. You hear it with all sorts of rhythmic human activities and songs that were written or composed or evolved to function as entraining, organizing social principles, like work songs. But let me, as I said a moment ago, I wanted to talk a little bit about Renaissance music because it relates to your general discussion of art and technology. Okay. I studied Renaissance music because it was recommended to me as an undergraduate thesis by one of the professors who I was studying with. And I didn't know anything about Renaissance music before then, or any more than you get in a regular musical history one-term course. But the Renaissance and other eras of music, I'm focusing on the Renaissance because that's what I studied, but this is true for other eras as well. The technology of the era evolved the music and the art and the music evolved the ongoing technology. And in the Renaissance, two really interesting aspects come to mind. One is the evolution of what was church music and polyphonic music into secular music. And when I talked about entrainment before, religious music, church music, particularly Catholic church music, was was to bring a kind of spiritual entrainment to the people in the church listening to the music, a poetic, symbolic entrainment. That evolved in the Renaissance and later in the Baroque and classical music, and we're talking about Western European music now. That evolved into secular music and secular entrainment. But the other interesting thing, and this relates a little bit more to technology, is the evolution of two technologies. One, particularly musical technology, the evolution of keyboards. Prior to the Renaissance, there were simple organs and there were clavichords. Through the Renaissance and then into the Baroque, we developed first harpsichords and then pianos. And these were very instrumental in the development of even orchestral and other forms of music by laying out visually and spatially the scale.
Right.
But the other interesting thing, and I find, even when I think about this now, I find this really profound, is the emergence of the Gutenberg printing press. The Gutenberg printing press made books available and hence individual learning, informational experience to the, quote, masses, where before you had to read Latin and most people were not fluent in Latin. They couldn't read at all. So the printing press opened up individual experience, and it was the first individual media creation technology. But the other interesting thing about it is that it has sustained us all the way through to the 21st century.
Right.
Because most people, setting aside the individual expression and experience of information on an iPad, for example, which is a vast expansion of the Gutenberg galaxy, as McLuhan used to call it. But integrated circuits, microprocessors, the foundational electronics are all artifacts of printing. They are lithography.
Right.
And so it's interesting to understand that our technology today, our electronic technology today, evolved out of the printing press and being able to print things, and particularly images, lithography. So I studied Renaissance music. I wrote a term paper on a particular composer, but it led me deeply into the understanding of music as an entrainment process, as a symbolic and poetic process, and as one that was tied to the technology and the spirit of the times. And for my spirit of the times, it was the beginning of television, computers, and electronic music and electronic devices. I hope that made some sense.
Yeah, it does. Now, the one thing I'm wondering, though, is you kind of also tied that to chemistry, which I assume in some way you were implying a touchstone with, like, brain chemistry or emotional response, the physical chemistry behind that. How does that tie in?
Well, first, generally, we're all chemistry. And in fact, we're all electricity, because chemistry is basically electricity. The molecular bonding and interactions of all molecules, whether they're DNA or anything, chlorophyll, anything that's living and or not even living, inorganic chemistry. These are all electronic. They have to do with the electrons in the molecules and in the atoms.
Right.
So on a fundamental level, we're all electricity and we're all chemistry. And when we talk about music, we're talking about biology. Because when I say spirit animating form equals art, we're talking about something that's intrinsic in biology, the making of art and the making of technology. These are not things that are isolated or separate or unique to human beings, and they're not unique to, how shall I say it, they're not tied specifically to the technology without the biology.
Right, I see, yeah.
I'm probably being a little confusing because it's a hard thing to wrap your head around, the idea that, or I guess the best way to put it is, it takes biology and these biological entities, human beings, to play instruments. Mm-hmm. And while there's a lot of discussion about music being generative without human beings, in fact, the idea that there's music, however it's created, is a chemical idea.
Right. It requires that chemical reaction in order for us to make that identification. Yeah.
Right. It's physiological.
Right.
Which is chemistry. And when I say spirit animating form, I'm thinking about, I don't have them in front of me, but quotes by Charlie Parker, the famous bebop saxophone player, but also by Ansel Adams, photographer, and Alfred Stieglitz, photographer from the the early part of the 20th century, where they equated art as an affirmation of life, right, and that art was completely entwined with art. And those kinds of thoughts influenced me as a biologist as well as a musician, because I realized, and this relates to Seastones, that the art that you create is not only part of your life, part of your history, your natural history, but it is an affirmation of your life. It is a manifestation of you as a biological as well as a technological entity.
I see. Right. Okay. So that then leads us to how you brought all of this stuff together to formulate some sort of kind of working process, right?
Right. Well, again, without being too structured or academic, composition, which is what we want to talk about, can be divided up into two areas, I think, or at least I divided them that way. One is what is now called pre-composition, and we've just talked a lot about that. It's how you live your life and what you think about, and composition. And composition, there's a couple of different dimensions that are important in composition when you start thinking about composition. If you don't think about composition, you still can compose. But when you take on the mantra of being a composer, and all artists in a sense are composers in the sense that they're composing in the media that they choose, then you have to think about meaning and intention. And you have to think about the metaphors or the models, the forms that you're using, unless you're doing what they used to call, let's say, free jazz, which is forming as you're playing rather than pre-forming and then filling the form. And then there are the processes. And to tie this to electronic music, for example, when I did Seastones, when I started Seastones, I was introduced to 16-track tape recording. But prior to that, it was all cutting up and splicing 2-track tape. It was an electromechanical function to compose electronic music.
Right.
And by the time I was done with Seastones, we had gotten to digital control of analog. And now with in the last 30 years or so, we've gotten into full digital composition. But there is all of these processes that are involved as models or metaphors for composition. In synthesis, there's additive synthesis and subtractive synthesis and FM synthesis and digital synthesis. There's mathematical synthesis. So there are choices that are made for you by the form that you've chosen or that you choose to adopt. And those all are associated, again, with, I like to use the word metaphors, though it might be imprecise. You can choose metaphors. So, again, to get deeply into sound synthesis for a moment, you can have sounds that evaporate. You can have sounds that condense. You can have forms that assemble, that are mobile. Seastones is one of those. Mm-hmm. You can have forms that replicate. Generative music is like that. You can have forms that come from natural history like geology or biology, growth, physical processes. All of these things were in my personal encyclopedia of thoughts and processes that led me to Seastones and its mobile score. And my ties to jazz and improvisation and pre-composition for improvisation were fulfilled in 5 years that I did Seastones.
Right. Okay. When you talk about mobile composition, what is the manifestation of that? What does that look like? I mean, did you have like written scores, or are you using that phrase as sort of like your mental collection of what you were working on?
Actually, both. If you go to, the bands that I played with, but all bands have a set of tunes, say the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. When they do a concert, they don't necessarily do them in the same order each time. The ordering may have to do with the mood of the crowd, the mood of the musicians. It may have to do with other poetic or symbolic or other issues. So mobility is not a unique process to what I did compositionally, except to define a composition and the listening experience of that composition as being open. So when you listen to Seastones, you have a choice of listening in whatever order you want to choose by random shuffle or by selection. Mm-hmm. And a symphony is composed to be heard in movement 1, movement 2,
Right,
movement 3,
right.
movement 4.
Yes, I got it.
I'm creating symphonic music, or was creating symphonic music that you could move the order around.
I see.
And
Right.
and juxtaposed different components, pieces of the total composition at different times to fit different circumstances, or to show the beauty of juxtaposing pictures. It's one of the reasons that I got more deeply into photography later in life, which was to view pieces of music or as like photographs. So you could juxtapose them side by side, or look at one and then the other, or look at one and then look back at the other. It also evolved in my mind from jazz and from free jazz, which was the thing when I was growing up. And you had freedom to interpret forms differently, but you also had freedom to create form or have form emerge as you were playing. And then I even asked the questions of my musician friends, can we ever do tunes where we start off jamming and the end of the tune is actually the beginning?
Right.
So you don't state the melody, the melody of the song, or sing the words to the song until the end. And these all, created very interesting playing environments for the musicians that I played with, my friends.
That's cool. Now, so let's talk about Seastones in particular, because I find that those compositions are really amazing. But also this idea now, this discussion of like the mobile score and and sort of the way that you built them to be, almost kind of like you were thinking ahead of someday the iPod Shuffle will do its thing, right? It's really quite amazing because they're these small vignettes almost. And when you say that, when you tie it to your photography, I mean, it kind of makes sense because they almost they feel like instances of a thing rather than a tune. I mean, there are some that are kind of tuneful, but they actually more often feel like, I think back to like Pierre Schaeffer when he talked about sound objects, right? There's something about the Seastones that are very object-like. And I'm wondering, is that something that you had specifically in your mind when you were creating them?
Yes, I can answer that directly. The title Seastones comes from my experience on the beach of picking up Seastones, filling my pockets with Seastones at the beach and looking at them individually, and each one coming from a different geological epoch and, situation, and seeing them juxtaposed on the beach, continuously juxtaposed on the beach. So each one is crafted, each Seastone's musical form, I call them moment forms, are individually crafted, but they're, in a sense, all from the same beach, even though they could span, in terms of music or in terms of geological time, millions and millions of years and different epochs, different life forms existed. One of the influences on me and on some of the musicians that I was working with for Seastones was James Joyce. Part of it was Ulysses, and part of it was trying to get through Finnegan's Wake. Finnegan's Wake just had everything under this, everything that Joyce had under the sun cooked into it. So there's, Seastones aspires to that level of poetic, symbolic, encyclopedic content.
Well, I just, one of the things I found was that it's really hard for me to sometimes recognize that, because I purchased the CD version, and so I have kind of this modern or semi-modern experience of putting a CD in and then listening to like 40 odd tracks in a row or whatever. And then if I want to shuffle them around or whatever, I can. But it's hard for me to take my mind and realize that this was done in a period from 1970 to 75, correct?
Right, yes.
Yeah, because there are parts of that sound like they could easily be pulled out of today's Berlin minimal techno tracks. And there are other parts that sound like they could easily be part of a Eno-esque ambient compilation album. And there's other parts that sound, for all intents and purposes, like historical, archival tape music studio experiments, right? And it's shocking to me that you had all of that stuff kind of cooking in your brain during that period of time, which actually, I mean, it predates techno by a long shot, but also kind of predates our modern ambient music, Ligeti notwithstanding. I mean, it predates what we think of as modern electronic ambient music by quite a bit. And so I'm just curious, what were the things that spoke to you and kind of brought those things to the fore? Was like, so the techno-y things, was it because your interaction with the sequencers or with the way that you were using computers to do sequencing, that was a natural outgrowth of that? And in the ambient stuff, was it because of some of the affordances of either the studio technology or access to 16-track recorders or whatever? What are the things that like drew those different sounds out of you?
I don't have a single answer to that. I'll give you a couple of answers of probably many answers that I could give.
Yeah, because I asked for kind of many. Yeah.
Some of it is my various jazz experiences. Some of it is my various classical experiences. There are fugues and canons and various contrapuntal pieces there. Why I mentioned Joyce a few minutes ago is Joyce was very worldly in his writing and consuming of all sorts of literature and poetry throughout the history of mankind. So part of it was what Jerry Garcia said to me. He called me the first case of information overload.
Right.
And part of it is just having the curiosity and the hunger to absorb and process all of the different kinds of music that I loved and played. And again, I became more of a visual and photographic artist later, but a lot of those pieces, not a lot of them, a good number of them, but not a lot of them, are paintings. I experienced when I was growing up color field painting, Rothko and Newman in New York. And so some of the pictures, I talked about metaphors a few minutes ago. There are a lot of visual metaphors in the music, which you might describe as ambient or Eno-like, but these are things that the people who made those music and are making it today, those are things that were part of their environment, whether they acknowledged it or were even aware of it, but they assimilated. So there's cubism in Seastones, there's pointillism in Seastones, there's impressionism in Seastones.
Right.
But as I said, there's many answers to this because they're just part of music and creating and feeling the meaning while you're creating. That are sort of intrinsic. That's the biology part of it that I was trying to describe a few minutes ago. You reminded me of something else. We talked last time a little bit about instruments and synthesis and group improvisation, collective improvisation, which is again in Seastones. But one of the things that I realized was a group of 4 or 5 musicians is an analog synthesizer. And an analog synthesizer is a group of 4 or 5 musicians. And so a lot can follow just from those two different aspects or different views or perspectives. And again, going back to Renaissance music, what was going on in the Renaissance? The evolution in painting of foreground and background due to the use of vanishing points. So the whole idea of where an observer was and what was going on was also evolving at the same time the printing was evolving. And polyphony was evolving into more modern harmonic musical structures and forms. I hope I haven't gotten too obtuse.
No, that's cool. Now, so this is really fascinating, and it's really interesting to think. I hadn't really thought about like the forms of like these different artistic forms kind of all being in the air at the time and having sort of like this visual influence on you. Now, I'm sure another thing that was influential in the making of Seastones was the combination of people that you were working with. I mean, and frankly, I think a lot of interviews that I've seen with you really focus on this part of it, which is like, oh, you worked with Jerry Garcia and you worked with Phil Lesh and David Crosby and Grace Slick and Mickey Hart. And what was that like, But I imagine that their influences, both in, in people's reaction to their music making, but also the fact that they were very creative people themselves probably also had an influence on you and the freedom that you felt when you were working with them on the creation of the Seastones material.
I was fortunate to meet and interact and play and share times with a group of great musicians and artists and people. I had written Jerry Garcia a letter when I was at MIT, and when he came to MIT, he found me. We became friends. We shared interests in art. When he would visit on the East Coast or play on the East Coast outside of the Grateful Dead, we would visit. We played at his house and at Mickey's barn studio a lot just as duos. We shared a lot of music, and he taught me a lot and recommended people like Doc Watson and Floyd Kramer, who I should be listening to, and I taught him a lot about jazz and reharmonization and new music. It was just a really nice relationship, and he always had me set up next to him so that he could make sure we were closely playing to one another on stage. He was an artist, and that was found or publicized more late in his life and after he passed. But we shared an interest in art, and he loved coming to Boston and to New York in particular for the art communities that were there. I lived with Phil for a while before I found my own place when I moved to California. Phil was educated as a jazz and classical musician, studied with Luciano Berio at Mills, and we shared a lot of music together. Mickey Hart, again, a huge appetite for music. He had a barn studio here in Nevada, which he graciously gave me 16-track tape and allowed me to start recording Seastones. Through Mickey, I met a lot of people who were jamming out there. I met Barry Melton and John Cipollina and David Freiberg, who ended up on Seastones. But Cipollina and Freiberg were, at that point, early on, were still part of Quicksilver Messenger Service, another great San Francisco band that I had loved and heard of and listened to from the East Coast. Spencer Dryden, I met through Jerry and Phil. He had played with the Jefferson Airplane in one of the great jam bands with Jack Cassidy and Jorma Cook-Hagen. They were just as profound as the Grateful Dead in their ability to jam and play. Jerry told me secretly that Spencer was the half-nephew of Charlie Chaplin. So Spencer, who did percussion and drums on Seastones, was not only with the Jefferson Airplane, but he also was with the New Riders, which was a band that Jerry played with and toured with the country western band that played with the Grateful Dead.
Right.
Spencer told me that he was born in New York, though he grew up elsewhere, I guess LA or someplace. But he was very interested in asking me about the Berklee School of Music that I went to, the jazz school, and about the avant-garde in New York. A tremendous and tasteful and powerful drummer. Grace I met through Jerry and Phil. Jerry and Phil took me out when Grace and Paul Kantner were out in Stinson Beach, and David Crosby was in his boat just offshore. And then I visited them at the so-called airplane mansion off of Golden Gate Park a couple of times. And Grace and I worked 3 times, once with Barry Melton and Dan Healy and Mickey Hart and Phil and a bunch of other people around, and then twice just Grace and I and Mickey and Grace and I alone. And finally, last but not least, Phil introduced me to David Crosby when we were all jamming together at Mickey's and other places. And I got the opportunity to visit David at his house several times and on his boat, the Mayan. And he introduced me to Roger Payne's album of recorded whale song, the first whale song recordings. And we shared not only a beautiful love of nature and whales, but of interspecies communication. David, who's all over Seastones, both with electronic guitar and with voice, was and is such a powerful creator of beautiful vocal and acoustic instrument sounds. He's magical. Jerry was magical in his way. Phil magical in his way. Mickey magical in his way. Grace magical in her way. David Freiberg and Spencer magical in their ways. I was very lucky to have such partners, friends, and contributors to my work.
Sure. So you did this work from 70 to 75, and it's a pretty incredible body of work. It was released back at the time, and then, but you re-released it, and then where I kind of most recently ran across it was that Important Records is doing a vinyl release of some of it too. What is the release history of Seastones? Because it seems like it's a little, I don't know what's the right word. Maybe it's a little strangled. Maybe it just didn't follow a path that it could have or should have. But what's the situation that has led to where it sits now?
First of all, a general disclaimer: it was not my goal in life back then, when I was in my 20s, to be ahead of my time. But I was accused of that even then, and I said, no, I'm living in my time. And Grace lived in her times, and Crosby lived in his times, and Garcia lived in his times, and Phil Lesh lived in his time, and Mickey Hart lived in their times. It's just that the times included much more than what gets distilled down in the media and broadcast.
Right.
Seastones was released in 75, in April of 75. And it was planned to be the first release of maybe more releases and live playing. But a few weeks after that, the record label, Grateful Dead Records, Round Records, was sold to United Artists.
Oh.
So Seastones, which has gotten reviewed twice in Rolling Stone and was climbing the FM airplay charts, it was at one point above Gladys Knight and the Pips, believe it or not. I was shocked. But they had to pull all the stock from the store to relabel it. And so once it got back in the stores, all the momentum had been lost.
Sure.
Eventually, within a year of that, I just left music. There was no continuity towards a bright and rosy future. And I just went into technology and worked at various jobs and careers after that for a long time. In 1990, Ryko approached me. At that point in time, their major names was David Bowie and Frank Zappa. And I think they were looking to an entry into the Grateful Dead world. And I agreed to a release of Seastones because I wanted to buy the house that I was living in with my cat.
Okay.
And not for a reestablishment of a musical career.
I see.
Seastones, the LP, as you talked before, was created as a mobile form before there were mobile forms, before there were CDs, before there were iPods, before you could create an individual playlist. So the LP has been mistaken for the definitive version, and it's not. It's just one version with 7 different overlaid moment forms out of close to 100 pieces that could have been used. Ryko put it out, and it was on CD, but somehow the mistake was made that the track markers didn't carry forward. So you got 2 versions, 2 different Seastones sets, but you couldn't shuffle them individually.
It was like one big track?
Yeah, well, 2 big tracks because there were 2 versions.
Right, okay.
And at that point, I really gave up.
Oh, man.
But as I said, I was doing this to buy a house for me and my cat. I wasn't doing it, to get a down payment. And then in 2000, I did an interview with David Gantz for his first on the radio, where he said you could come on for 15 minutes and play some tapes. And I ended up being there doing a benefit for KPFA for 3 hours. We did another 8 hours of interviews, and he included me in his book.
Right.
And I still didn't do anything. And then 5 years later, I decided, because I still had some of the 16 tracks and 4 tracks and 2 tracks and quad mixes, that I would go to Fantasy Records and have them transferred to digital for future posterity. And then in 2008, 9, 10, I started playing again at home with friends. Barry Finnerty, Barry Sless, Dwayne Pate, Kevin Hayes, Celso Alberti, and others, where we were just record, and I was the engineer as well as the lead performer, and recording on a laptop, all on headphones with electronic drums for the most part. And it was the supportive, good feeling of being able to play with people again and play live that led me to release Seastones after releasing Cat Dreams, the first music that I had done since Seastones.
Got it. The work with Important Records then was just kind of an add-on to that. Because I know John there likes helping, taking these historically rich things and bringing them out on vinyl and stuff. So Is that how that relationship happened?
John is great. I have to say he's great, and his catalog is just super excellent. He approached me just 2 years ago to release a vinyl version of Seastones, either the original or however I wanted to do it. And so we worked collectively on that, and I'm very happy. He took care of all of the mastering and all of the sound issues for vinyl, and the packaging is really pretty. And so it does give Seastones a life. I had released in 2000, I guess it's 2018 now, I had released the mobile form of Seastones, still only part of the composition. I still have the rest to release, and perhaps there'll be more from Important Records in the future. But the audience, it's interesting, the audience sort of partitions itself by experience into those who still like to get a sequential thing from the composer.
Of course, sure.
And so vinyl is an interesting medium. It's not an interesting medium for me because I grew up on vinyl.
Right.
So, I grew up on vinyl that went to 8-track, that went to cassette, that went to CD, that went to digital.
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. I get it.
Yeah. We've been around this track before. And so John and others had to even convince me that, because I'm not a vinyl person, and I haven't had a turntable for decades, that this was something to do. But there's a whole audience of audiophiles and people who would like to get a set from Seastones that's created by the composer. And so I don't view it as so much locking the form of Seastones into one form or another as much as it is providing on a special media a high quality set. It's like a Grateful Dead concert.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's like a group of musicians choosing what they're going to play in a night. They make a set list, and that's the expression you're getting that evening. That's kind of what you've done with these physical manifestations. Right.
And being the scientist, I actually asked a bunch of people, including people who had written reviews of Seastones in the past, to recommend set lists.
Nice.
So that it wouldn't be necessarily... it would be my choice, but it would be an educated choice.
It would be informed, yeah.
Yeah. That was an interesting collective process as well.
Now, as part of reading up on this, and I think this is on your Spirit Cats website, some of the Seastones material was lost at one point, right?
Some of it has been lost permanently.
Yeah.
Okay. I survived the flood of '82 here in Northern California, but where my stuff was stored went under 8 feet of water.
Oh, I see.
I had lived as a kid growing up on the East Coast. We had hurricanes, we had snowstorms. We lived a little bit above, we didn't live at sea level, so we never got flooded or anything, but I had seen the Mississippi River flooding and devastation. But living through a flood in '82 was just amazingly disgusting. That's all I can say. Disgusting.
Right.
So you end up with oils and sewage and everything. When the water leaves,
of course,
everything is just, it's not that it got wet and now you can dry it out. It's it got wet and soiled.
Yeah. Well, so how were some of them still around? I mean, was it just that there were only some of them that were stored on tapes in your storage area and others were stored elsewhere? Or, I mean, I'm just surprised you didn't lose everything, because I just think of like the way I store stuff. It'd be like, if I lose one document, I've lost my whole library, because that's, all my stuff is just like in one spot, right?
This is just the 16 tracks. Well, let's just say 6 of the 16 tracks, and there were probably about 10 or 12 total, survived. There was a question of how high they were up.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Above sea level, and what they were, and without being too graphic, how they were positioned. You fill a storage closet not ever thinking that it's going to be
partially
inundated
underwater
with cardboard boxes.
Right.
And you know what happens to cardboard when it gets wet? It collapses.
Yeah. Right. Okay, I get the picture now. Yeah, and combine that with oil and sewage, and there's your answer, right?
One of my musician friends said, the sea actually came to get Seastones.
The sea came for its stones. That's hilarious. So you left, after the situation went down with the original release of Seastones, you talk about having gotten kind of disgusted and leaving music. I mean, was it literally kind of from the bad taste of that experience? Was it also related to your interaction with the Grateful Dead? Or was it just that you mentally and emotionally were ready to move into something else?
After we played at Winterland in October for the Grateful Dead movie and their retirement, we all continued playing and jamming in the studio and working on and through the winter of 74, 75 and into the spring of 1975, working on a new Grateful Dead album, but again, jamming mostly at Bob Weir's studio, and joined often by David Crosby and sometimes by John Cipollina. Seastones was released in April of 1975. I had already started because the record company, Grateful Dead Round Records, owed me studio time. I was already using Bob Weir's studio after hours to record more stuff with David Crosby and more stuff as jams with most of the musicians. A few months later, after Seastones was released, for various reasons, the Round Records, Grateful Dead Records, and the movie rights were transferred to United Artists. Jerry, at that point, was interested in making movies. He was interested in playing a variety of different musics besides the Grateful Dead.
Well, and I think that also people might now have forgotten that the Dead were actually imagined themselves to be retiring at that point, right?
Yes, and everybody, Bob and Jerry and me and Phil and Mickey, we all had separate groups that we were playing in, or multiple groups that we were playing in. We were supposed to do a gig in June of 75, which was Jerry Garcia and Friends, which was the Grateful Dead plus me. Mm-hmm. And we all planned that I would continue to be a separate entity. But one of the things that was clearly apparent after 74 and through 75 was the musical world that I had happily and wonderfully entered in 1970, and all the musicians that we've talked about had really changed. One of the major changes was the Vietnam War was over. Mm. And so the counterculture was evolving and changing. The musicians were all much better known and famous in their own right. That's why they were all going to their own separate groups. And so the openness that existed in 70, 71, 72, 73, with everybody jamming with everybody, was slowly dissolving, evaporating away. So it wasn't the same community, or it was a community that was evolving in a different direction. For new music, which is really what I represented, as well as doing studio work, that left me in a financially, I should say, and socially vulnerable place. The only people that I knew were the Grateful Dead. When that dissolved into different places, I had to figure out what we were going to do. We continued doing Seastones gigs. That's me, Phil, Jerry, Mickey, and David Crosby through November of 75. And during the summer of 75, I was flown down to United Artists. They thought they were going to put me, and this sounds funny today, they thought they were going to put me in People magazine as the first person who was performing with computers. And because of the Grateful Dead, they had me photographed by the star photographer who had photographed all the famous United Artists stars from the 60s and 70s and maybe even earlier. It was just very prestigious. And they actually came to one of our Seastones gigs, some of them, and put us in Billboard magazine. But because of the release of Seastones happening over the time that the United Artists transfer occurred, all the stock from the stores was pulled to relabel for United Artists. And once it was back in the stores, the momentum, the Rolling Stones interviews, the public relations money had all been used. So it was lost.
Right.
And the income and notoriety that would lead to more interest in gigs evaporated as well. And then, as I described a moment ago, everybody was doing other things. And so we had just gotten to the point of maybe becoming self-sufficient as a avant-garde electronic music, jazz rock entity when everybody was drawn into different places. Jerry, most notably, was the movie that he had to edit, and all the other musicians in other directions. So at the end of 75 into early 76, I just had to separate myself from that dream, and in fact from music that I had been doing since I was a kid, and find a way to continue forward.
Yeah, to get a gig, right. And so you, in fact, kind of, when you left music, though, you kind of ended up landing in the middle of technology. I mean, first of all, because of physically where you were, but also because your experience with dealing with a lot of different kind of, whether it was computational issues or whatever, you found yourself in kind of the right spot, right?
Through a friend in 1976, I got a job with one of the first home computer companies. And as we talked earlier, I had an Altair computer, the first home computer, which was on the cover of Popular Electronics in January of 1975. I still have it, number 113. And this was the computer that people like Jobs and Wozniak and Gates, all of those pioneers, first got as well. And I got a job working as an application engineer for one of the first S100 companies. The S100 was the bus that allowed that allowed you to expand the computer, because the computer started with just 256 bytes of memory. I got the job because prior to that, I had made an 8080, an Intel 8080 processor, work on a card that I had built myself. So I answered questions on the phone and helped customers. And I think I mentioned this to you. This was right next door. Their offices, the offices that I worked in my tie-in jacket, far cry from my Grateful Dead attire. This was right next to Bukla's facility, which I passed every day without ever entering. And it was just a few years earlier that I was using a Bukla box.
Oh, that's unreal.
It was a reminder each day of the world that I had painfully had to abandon for real life, I guess is the way to say it. Right. So I went on from working in home computing to a career in science and engineering, research and development. I continued to do some work on early home computing technology, and then I went on to image processing. I think I mentioned in one of our offline conversations how I was hired by Bill Etra, a New York video synthesist and entrepreneur, and we developed, I managed a group of software and hardware people who developed a digital video synthesizer that was controlled by a Radio Shack TRS-80 computer. And then I went on to biotechnology and immunology instrumentation for some well-known companies doing DNA and RNA and peptide synthesis and sequencing hardware. Early artificial intelligence, was a seed developer. I received the Macintosh before release to develop early monoclonal antibody and immunology software. Monoclonal antibodies have come to renown 30 years later for the COVID virus treatments. Later than that, because again, I got tired of commuting long distances, I retired from engineering R&D and science to do ecological and environmental planning and restoration work locally.
So then you went off on that, and normally for most people that move away from music, that's the end of it. You know, they wear their suit and tie until they get the gold wristwatch, and then, you know, kind of fade away and tell stories to their grandkids. But for you, for some reason, in 2008, you decided to start playing again, and it ended up leading to this group of musicians that you work with and you're recording with. So you end up coming out with the new release called Cat Dreams, which is very different from Seastones, first of all. It's clear that it's people that love playing. First of all, it's a very played album. It's a very human album, but it's also it's got some like really funny tweaks. I was talking to somebody about it, and I was like, you know, I think it's the first time I ever heard like postmodern country music. It was like kind of interesting mixes of of kind of like artistic concept with kind of traditional musical forms, and I just found it really clever and fun, and an interesting but very different release from what Seastones was.
Well, first of all, Cat Dreams is just other aspects of my musical personality. Seastones is
it's a thing.
I'm not a one-trick pony, as they used to say. And Cat Dreams was basically recorded, as I said before, in my living room on headphones on a laptop where I was both, in an M-Box Pro when I was the engineer and a player at the same time, which is a challenge. And it's basically a work of love, and I hope that comes through there. But the structure of Cat Dreams is sort of, in a sense, like the structure of Seastones, in it that they're the dreams of various cats that I've shared lives with, and so they could be listened in different orders, but they all have different forms and different kinds of depth and playing, and they were all visual in one sense or another, as dreams are. So, for example, there's a 3-piece set called The Big Cat Dance, and this is when all the cats go out and have a big party and dance. And this first one of the 3 is called Cat Samba. And Cat Samba, I play a Roland axe with polyphonic voices. So, for people who know me, it's a samba with allusions back to Renaissance polyphony and Renaissance scat singing. So the cats are like scat singing Renaissance. Then there's an interlude where I use various samples for dobro and pedal steel guitar and acoustic guitar and cello and everything, where the cats get into some catnip and turn a little crazy. And that leads to Cat Licks, which is the third movement of the Big Cat Dance, and that's the country western one that you're referring to. Mm-hmm. And that one I always visualize as the cats wearing cowboy hats and dancing on the floor. Like there used to be these bands in the 40s and 30s and 40s, these big band jazz bands, but they were big band country western bands, particularly in Texas. And so it's an allusion to that music. Sure. And I call it Cat Licks because it's all the cats. It's 4 different guitar players, 4 different cats playing guitars, all vying with one another, like saxophone players in jazz used to do,
for
competing
primacy,
And so it's an assemblage. Pardon any humor and pun intended, but it's an assemblage of licks. Cat licks.
Well, that also explains, because it's kind of interesting and in a way a little weird, the way that like different kind of phrases and different things kind of come in and out. So that actually makes a lot of sense. It's got that kind of almost visual, or it's almost like it's like the soundtrack for a thing that happened. It's just that you don't get the visual with it, right?
Right. And at one point, I'd hoped to find somebody who would do cartoons of some of these.
Oh yeah, right.
But that has eluded me. The guy who does my website used to work for Disney, but we haven't found anybody, at least yet, who's interested. Also on Cat Dreams, there are a couple of duos between me and Barry Finnerty, who's a great guitarist and who played in one of the Miles Davis electric bands, where he plays electric guitar and I play sampled cello on keyboard.
Right.
And it's worth noting when we talk about electronic music that everything I play here is all sampled, which there was no sampling or even digital technology at the time for Seastones. I love playing sampled cello, on keyboard. It's just so beautiful. Mm-hmm. But I used Roland electronic drums. I used soft synths. I used Reason. I used Reactor, Ableton Live, the Roland Axe, various other customized MIDI keyboards. Customized meaning I got into the electronics and screwed around with them a little bit.
Right.
And both Roland and Yamaha samplers. So it's not completely separate from my...
Your previous exercise. Yeah, I was going to say, it's funny because a lot of what you're talking about here is all stuff that is in its own way kind of as tweakable as it was when you were working with EMU modulars and Altair computers in a way. Right.
And, some of this goes back to my experiences with the Grateful Dead, and even prior to the Grateful Dead, listening to some country music, but not a lot. I was an East Coast elitist, for the most part jazz. But playing with the Grateful Dead, they did I played on American Beauty, their second sort of country album.
Right.
And while I wasn't a skilled country player, they had much better people for that. I really enjoyed playing that kind of music. It's truly American music, and it's truly, in a lot of ways, very deep music played by some very deep people, if you know the history of country music, or if you've seen the Ken Burns country music
series.
I'm proud to be able to have interacted with much better musicians than me, as I mentioned before.
Yeah, well, it's quite a group of people you have. In listening to it, I have to admit that I'm a real sucker for bass players, and I kind of mentioned this before offline. The bass player that you have on this, Dwayne Pete, just blew me away. It was so tasteful. I love tasteful bass playing like that, and that was just that was just a real touchstone for me, listening to this great grooving bass player just really standing out. What it really spoke to was kind of the live nature of this recording at a time when it's so easy to like overdub things in excess. There was definitely a live orientation to the sound of this album.
Well, I should have mentioned this. If I had a public relations person, they would have told me to mention this.
Yeah.
Well, every one of those is a first take.
Oh, interesting.
Okay. So even when I played long 8-minute solos, take one, I absorbed that from two people. Frank Sinatra, who hated to do things over again.
Uh-huh.
And Miles Davis.
Well, but like, how did you set it up then? Did you just say, okay, imagine a bunch of cats wearing cowboy hats, go?
No, I didn't do any of that.
Okay.
I played a couple of themes where I noodled around a little bit and then it settled down. And, like when I did a duo with Barry Finnerty, he's just great at that. That's what I meant way at the beginning when we started talking today. That's what I meant about chemistry. That's just chemistry.
Right.
I had the chemistry for a while with Jerry and Phil and David Crosby and those people and the musicians. And I wish I could take more credit, but the sensitivity and experience and musicality of the people that I played with that, I really want to point to, and you're pointing to Dwayne Pate on bass and Barry Finnerty and Kevin Hayes and Celso Alberti. When we did Cat Samba, it was I just started playing it.
Yeah.
And they just played.
That's wild. That's really cool.
And they do studio work and they play with some of the greatest bands. Dwayne has played with everything from Ray Charles type bands to salsa bands to, I believe, I hope if he ever hears this, I think he actually even played with Robert Goulet and Florence Henderson.
Nice.
And
you better groove if you're going to play with Robert Goulet.
Yeah, right. But the point being is that these people, even deeper than me, are just music.
Yeah.
Not musicians, they're music.
They're music, yeah.
And that's what all musicians aspire to be.
Now, in addition to this, and it's amazing to hear these stories and kind of the duration of this, but there's this other track of artistry that you got into, which is photography. And, it was first noticeable to me when the cover of your Seastones album has this beautiful picture of the Seastone. And then when I went on your website, I saw you had a section on the photography, and it's really quite amazing. But for me, what was actually kind of interesting about it too was the way that you kind of categorize things. You have what you call metaphysics, which is like this combination of nature photos, but then also like art pieces that you photographed. And it was just, there was something about it that caught me a little bit by surprise, but I actually really found compelling because there was clearly a relationship between them without it being overt, without it being like, here's a picture of a sun, here's a drawing of a sun, right? It was more like you introducing the shape of the world in different ways. I just found it really beautiful and interesting.
Thank you for your comments, your kind words about my photography. When I left music a few years later, after doing some digital video work, I started doing photography again. I had been doing photography as a kid for nature work, but also for recording my science projects and my museum specimens in my home lab. And I started with a Bakelite camera, Bakelite plastic camera, a baby brownie. And my first work was to photograph animals. My first work was to photograph animals in relatively bare cages at the time at the Bronx Zoo, which my mother then made into an album for me, a book, my first photo book. I speak about that because it had a profound effect on what photography, the emotions and the responses and the thoughts that it could evoke, even as someone as young as a 5-year-old. From childhood onward, as I said, I was using it just basically for nature and for science. But beginning after digital video and then continuing now, I guess, for the next 40 years, I was photography and to some degree painting have been my primary creative activities. I studied all of Ansel Adams' 3 books and his work and the work of many other fine photographers, Elliot Porter and Walker Evans and Edward Weston, and worked on all different size cameras, including large format cameras, and have done aerial photography. Photography for me is, since I don't travel and I'm not interested in doing documentary or news kinds of photography or historical photography, photography for me is about where I live and the things that I see and interact with where I live. And mostly that's nature photography and rocks. We talked about mobile forms. Pictures and photography are the ultimate mobile forms. Mm-hmm. Music evolves and is presented over a period of time, even though it can become timeless. But photographs are often juxtaposed, and so a lot of my artist books, my collections of photographs with certain creative ideas or motifs, juxtaposed photographs with drawings that I do in the sand at the beach. And again, you and I talked offline, but it's interesting that on one hand, I do photography with digital cameras, state-of-the-art digital cameras, and on the other hand, I do artwork by drawing in the sand at the beach. There's a range of technology there that goes back to prior to Homo sapiens to whatever the future holds for us. And the other thing about photography, which is sort of different from music, is that when you look at a picture, the picture looks at you. I know that sounds a little Zen-like and cryptic. A photographer is recording, showing, making present a way of seeing. And so when somebody looks at a picture, they're looking at the way they see as well as the way the photographer or the painter who made the picture sees. Again, my paintings and my photographs are all about where I live. And I think that's very important for an artist or even for a musician, that the deep well of creativity is an affirmation and a presentation or a presencing of their life.
Sure. And so then what's next on the horizon for you? I mean, in a way, it seems like with photography and these sand drawings, you've kind of mapped out artistic direction. Are you going to stay focused on that, or are you going to revisit more music? Are you going to take the Cat Dreams concept and expand it? What's the future look like for you?
First, a quick answer: more pictures, more writing, more painting, and more music. As you know, I have a large website, spiritcats.com, and one of the wondrous things about technology today is the fact that for individuals, not for groups and not for production companies or record companies, but for individuals, you have direct access through technology now to the world, and the world has direct access to you. That seems sort of obvious to say today, but it wasn't 50 years ago.
Right.
Spirit Cats has had hits from 136 countries that I never even heard of, isolated islands in the Pacific, all over Asia, all over Africa, I'm very proud to say, and all over South America. So when we think of, in the past, of small audiences, today there's the audiences for Seastones, for example, may be small locally or in a small area, but they're larger if you can now include people from all over the world and
sure.
Over 100 countries. And it leads one to, again, back to art coming from personal life and from life in general. It's an affirmation of life. We talked about mobility in Seastones, which was an artistic and compositional idea that I worked with in the early 70s. In a mathematical or even a movie sense, it would be called nonlinear time. Today, with technology, everything is sort of mobile. You can go to my site and look at things in whatever order you want to look at them. You can juxtapose them in whatever order you want to look at them. And that's also true for music. As I mentioned earlier, I have still been working with Ableton Live and Reactor and Pro Tools, but I haven't decided yet to finish or release any new music. I'm still trying to complete Seastones and the rest of Cat Dreams. When you realize that you have people who are interested or appreciative of what you do, i.e., they've become friends of your work, you realize that doing art music for friends or for loved ones or for your dogs and cats, if you so choose, is a way of life. And so I'm glad that I had the opportunity to talk to you about what happened in my musical life. But the mobility, the idea of mobility, means that there are many beginnings, many middles, and many ends to things, not just one linear sequence. And a lot of people see that in their lives. A lot of musicians do, a lot of artists do, and I'm proud to contribute to that. Yeah. And so more pictures, more music, more writing, more art.
Well, Ned, I want to thank you for taking time to have these discussions. I feel like I've learned not only so much about you, but actually I've gotten insights into the world that you've been able to open up for me. I want to thank you for that, and thank you for having these fantastic and in-depth discussions.
Thank you. I will cherish this.
Yeah, so will I. So will I. Well, with that, then, we will say goodbye. Have a great one.
Same to you.
Many thanks again to Ned for having the great chat, getting a chance to talk about working with his friends, his compositional process, his work in photography, and even his wind-up of his musical, quote, career. I really do appreciate his openness in discussing all of this. If you want to learn a little bit more, we have a neat little extra piece over on Patreon for our Patreon subscribers. At the $5 a month level, there's actually additional interviews that generally run with each interview. And in this case, Ned talked a little bit about listening to and playing through the Grateful Dead's Wall of Sound system, which I think everyone's seen pictures of that. So take a peek over there and check it out. If nothing else, the Patreon even has postings during the midweek and on off weeks that are available to the entire public. So feel free to jump over there, subscribe if you can. That's patreon.com/DarwinGross. And that is, in fact, what supports the podcast, what keeps the lights on over here. So if you can help out, please do. With that, I'm going to let you have your week. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, drop me a line. ddg@cycling74.com, darwin.gross@gmail.com, or ddg@20objects.com. They all get to me. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll catch you next time around.